How do you know if your startup is working? How do you know if you found what investors call product market fit? Product market fit is a term that investors use a lot. It's what we look for when we invest in companies. And really what it means is that the product or service you've built is actually solving the need that you had previously identified. It means you have, out of nothing, created something that people want. And when you've accomplished that, you know you have a startup. Today, I want to emphasize that there are two parts that you always need to be looking at. You need to always look at quantitative and qualitative signals. What do I mean by that? Quantitative is look at numbers. How many people are using my product? These numbers come from server logs, they come from instrumentation that you've put into your product, they come from sales numbers. Actually look at numbers. Don't be afraid of numerical analysis. But numbers never tell the entire story. Also, make sure you continue to observe users. In much the same fashion that I talked about when I talked about validation and when I talked about the MVP. Spend time with individual users, see how they use your product or service. And that is a very qualitative approach. Both of these have to be pointing in the right direction. Why is that? Well, it's very easy sometimes to think you have good-looking numbers. But in the early days of a startup, you won't know yet, for instance, how long people will use your product for, how long you will retain them, or whether they will try it out because it's a novelty and then go away. Eventually, over time, some of that will show up in the numbers, and you can do what's called a cohort analysis, where you look at people who started using your product service on a certain date, how many of them continue using it. But when it's still early, like when you're a month into it, you can't know what your 1 year retention will be. You don't have data on your 1 year retention. But 1 month into it, you can spend time with users, and you can see how they react to the product, whether they're enthusiastic, whether it's easy for them to use, or whether they struggle, whether they're frustrated with it. So it's very important that when you look at your metrics, you look at both, am I bringing new customers, new users in, but also are my existing users continuing to use the product? We think of the first thing as growth and the second as engagement. And you want both growth and ongoing engagement. This is true not just for consumer products, but also for B2B products. It's not good enough that somebody signs up for your, let's say, new analytics service if they never look at the analysis. Eventually, if people are not using your product, they will stop paying you for your product. It is crucial, and I can't overemphasize this enough, to not just be stuck with your head in the numbers or to just think, oh, I'm going to talk to a bunch of users. You really can only understand whether things are working if you can do both. Almost all teams that I've experienced have a natural gravitation towards one or the other. Some teams are very numbers oriented, and so they really seem afraid of meeting with customers and getting that hands-on experience of how is the customer reacting to the product. And some teams are very intuitive and they love spending time with customers, but they don't want to look at the numbers. And both of these tend to overlook often glaring things. So if you want to know whether you found product market fit, make sure you study the numbers, and if that's not you, find somebody else on your team or hire somebody or go show your numbers to another founder or to an investor and say, hey, these are the numbers I'm getting. Are those good numbers? What do you think of them? What should I compare them to? And make sure you take the time to actually watch people one-on-one using your product and see how they react and what they get stuck on. Each time that I've invested in a company and that I've spent time with a company on doing both things, I and the company have learned new things that they didn't previously know. One of the wonderful examples of that is in the early days of Etsy, we did a bunch of one-on-one user testing. And it turned out nobody who came to the site for the first time realized that these were all handmade craft goods. We all knew it. The founders knew it. That's, after all, what they had built the service for. We, the investors, knew it because that's what we had invested in. But we knew it because we had told ourselves the story of what we wanted the service to do. They did not have the context that was in our heads, in the heads of the founders and the heads of the investors. And so we very quickly learned that we had to communicate that much more clearly and much more upfront. Another great way, and maybe the most decisive way that you know you have some degree of product market fit, is when you get people to pay for your product. Many consumer services used to be free, but we're now seeing a wave of paid consumer services, consumer subscription products. If people are willing to pay a subscription for your product, clearly they're getting value from it. Often, companies are afraid in a B2C or a B2B setting to ask for the order, to ask for the bill, to put a price on it. They want to launch the product for free and they want to say, oh, let's see whether it's growing free. If you've really built something that's valuable, almost always you can charge for it. And even just attempting to charge for it, even if you decide that you want to optimize for growth, just the act of going to ask people for money will tell you whether they are truly seeing that this product that you've built is solving a need for them, or whether they're just exploring and playing around with things. People like novelty, people like to try out new services, even in a business setting. But a very good measure of the value you're creating is your ability to charge for the product. Why is it so important to really dig into the numbers and to really spend time with users? Well, it's important because you don't want to hire a lot of people. You don't want to go raise money. You don't want to keep plugging away if you haven't actually solved the problem. Like, don't put the foot on the gas on your company until you know you've really got something. And if you haven't, go back to iterating. Make changes. Keeping in mind, don't just add features. If you're going to add something, take something away until you have something that's working. And this is important because the most valuable thing that you have in life is your time. And you don't want to be pouring your time into something that's not working. In the extreme, when things are not working, you can wind up with something like Theranos. It's a company that wound up raising hundreds of millions of dollars and never had a working product. And at all times, they told themselves and their investors and their potential customers that they had something that was working. And a lot of time, a lot of people's important part of their lives were ultimately wasted on an effort that never really worked. There is a question as to how long you should stick with something if it's not working. And I can't answer that question for you. This depends on your conviction, this depends on your resources, that depends on your passion for it. As long as you don't try to grow things that aren't working, if you have the means of continuing to iterate on something, you probably should.